Good morning, everybody. This is Andrew Ross Sorkin, founder of DealBook and columnist at the New York Times. Thank you so very, very much for joining us here on the DealBook Debrief call. I'm joined, of course, by Jason Carrion, DealBook's editor. And this week, we have the pleasure of having Maggie Haberman back, of course, the star White House correspondent for the New York Times, to help us try to sort through what may come over the next, we're about 110 days now away from the election, and there are some huge questions about what economic policies may be in play. Of course, the implications of COVID and the continued spread that we're seeing around the country, school closures and school openings, vaccines and everything else. And for all of that, we want to talk to Maggie and try to get inside the White House to understand what's happening. Just a couple of quick notes. This is an audio only event, so you won't be seeing us on the screen there. It is being recorded, and of course we'll make copies and replays available on social media, in tomorrow's DealBook as well, and of course on nytimes.com. And we want to make this as interactive as possible, so let me encourage you and encourage you early to submit questions at any time during this call in the Q&A window, and we will get to those questions very, very soon. But with all of that, let me introduce Maggie to the call. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back.
Sure.
We had a great conversation just about a month and a half ago now, but the world has moved remarkably. Just take us just inside. And as I said, we're about 110 days away from the election here, and take us a little bit inside the heads and the minds of those in the White House, because I think it's important that we try to understand how they're thinking about the world right now, because it does have such a huge implication on what kind of policies we may see in the form of stimulus and the like, and all of these other component parts, whether it be school reopenings and everything else that's connected to it.
Sure. So I would break that question down a little bit. There are a couple of different ways in which the White House is looking at the current landscape, but I would argue that one of them is not particularly realistically right. There is a discussion about another stimulus package, but all of that is and there's discussion about school reopenings. This is all in relation to the president trying to really will the country forward, largely in service of his reelection effort. The polling shows that the president does not do well with voters in terms of their view of his response to the coronavirus, that he still outpaces Joe Biden on the economy and dealing with it in polling. And that's what he's trying to get people focused on. And to that end, schools, if you're Donald Trump's schools, need to be reopened because that's how parents can get back to work. And that's how building blocks of society start working again. If you are President Trump, another stimulus is necessary to keep the economy going, because it looks as if some of the comeback in terms of jobs has stagnated. And then you have just in general, a number of aides around the president. The president's very frustrated by the existence of the coronavirus. He has been for some time. And you have aides to the president who encourage that view, who have tried to diminish, or as we've seen very publicly in the last week, undercut the public health experts to suggest that there are other people who the public should be looking at and listening to. I want to stress that this is an extraordinary thing in the middle of a pandemic, that the White House is undercutting its own administration members in the form of Dr. Anthony Fauci. So that's where the White House is, and the White House is looking at a dramatically changed electoral landscape that began changing because of the coronavirus and the economic downturn that was caused by it and by the shutdowns to deal with public health, but really was exacerbated by the fact that the president just showed himself incapable of meeting the moment. Any other president dealing with this challenge ahead of them, who had a strong economy going into 2020, might have chosen a different path, might have chosen not to do public briefings where they were berating reporters or claiming that the virus was being overstated or downplaying it or saying things that weren't true about case numbers and testing and his own administration's response. So the president is here and where he is as a byproduct of his own behavior, but the entire White House is conditioned to not let it be about him.
So, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the panic level, if there is panic, when it comes to looking at the polling numbers? You're seeing double-digit discrepancies between where the president is and where Biden now is, and what he may or may not have to do to close that gap.
So what the campaign will say is that their polling is tighter. They will say that that their numbers, both nationally and in battleground states, tend to be more favorable to the president than certainly our polling at the Times, or that almost every other public poll. But they acknowledge that the president's in trouble. They also look at the fact that in a deeply polarized electorate, that the chances of landslides seem smaller. That's certainly true in terms of the view of Joe Biden's campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, who has warned everyone in their world that the polls will likely tighten and they should keep their focus on getting to 270 electoral votes. Look, at the end of the day, Andrew, they know that they're dealing with a candidate who they can't control in President Trump. He is, as Jared Kushner said to Alex Burns and Jonathan Martin and me a few weeks ago, he's the campaign manager. He sets the tone, he sets the pace, he sets the reactions, and there's really nothing they can do to change his behavior.
And is he panicked at all? And the reason I ask about the sort of the level of panic, if you will, is really just to understand, to what extent the White House is going to be willing to go when it comes, frankly, to this conversation around stimulus in the next several weeks, because of course the current stimulus plans are going to run out, and what other measures he may be prepared to take from an economic perspective down the line between now and November.
So there's not a ton of discussion yet about what economic moves they'd be willing to make. There have been some scattered mentions of, after the president threatened to withhold funding from school districts, which if they didn't reopen, which most of his advisors told him was a very bad idea to say. There's been some vague conversation about, will we give, extra money as incentives to school districts and so forth. The next stimulus round is the one that is being looked at. But as you know, this is not taking place in a vacuum where it's just the White House. It's taking place against the broader backdrop of congressional politics and what the GOP wants versus what the Democrats want.
Well, so the other interesting play in all of this is, do you see Democrats prepared to push back on stimulus as some kind of political punishment to the president, at the same time that so much of the Democratic Party would argue that there are a lot of folks out there who desperately need money and need a stimulus program?
No, I think Democrats are very aware of what the political realities are around this, and while I think that they want to use what leverage they can to get what they want out of a stimulus bill, they want to extend enhanced unemployment. They want state and local funding program, which Republicans are skeptical of. So I don't think you're going to see Democrats cutting off their noses to spite their face, if that's what you're asking.
One of the things that we've heard the president repeatedly point to over his presidency, and even to this day, has been the stock market as a signal of the strength of the economy and what he would describe as his own success. But more recently, he has suggested when the markets have turned or ever turned against him, he's suggested that it's Biden's fault and that it's a sign that Biden may win, and that if Biden were to win, the stock market would fall further. Can you sort of take us inside that conversation, inside the president's mind and that of those around him?
Yeah, that's not really a conversation that is being driven by most of the people around him. That's how the president portrays almost everything in this kind of heads I win, tails you lose approach he has. He has treated the stock market like his own poll, as you correctly said. But he has to come up with some reason why a stock market downturn is not a referendum on him. And so to suggest that it's a referendum about Biden's future and what it could mean for the country, that is not not out of the realm of what's normal for how this president paints any bit of bad news for himself. It has no reflection in a broader conversation within the White House, and it has no reflection really in reality. But that is how he's going to spin it.
And in terms of, the last time we spoke, we were talking about some of the business leaders that the president would be on the phone with and that he would be leaning on, people like Steve Schwartzman and others. But we've heard a lot less about the business community's role in either advising, pressuring, or otherwise communicating with the president, or the president communicating with them over the past several weeks and probably now maybe longer than that. Is that because there's been just less reporting on that, or is it because there's been less of it?
No, I think it's because there's been less reporting on it, Andrew. I mean, I think the president is still having these conversations and they're still going on. But I think that, frankly, business leaders themselves do not want their names out there in public, and you would know this better than me. But I don't think it's good for them to be seen as trying to push reopenings over public health measures, which is, whether fair or not, how a lot of the reporting ended up being portrayed in the earliest months of the fight to contain the virus.
Well, I think you're absolutely right.
The fight that has been lost.
No, I agree with you. I was going to say, just from my own reporting, one of the great complications, I think, for business leaders over the past month has been even the issue of masks.
Exactly.
Walmart, obviously, in the past 24 hours, Kroger and so many other companies came out and said that they wanted to mask folks across the country. But because the president had come out earlier and made that comment about masking being political, it had put them on their heels, if you will, about trying to make a decision like that earlier. And how do you even articulate and communicate and talk to the president about that very issue when he's saying those things publicly? That's
exactly right. And look, I mean, you have found that has been the response, not just from business leaders, although that is certainly the case, but also from governors, who are Republicans and who are allies of the president, senators who are figuring out what to do. You've seen in particular a pretty stark break with the president from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was watching his Republican caucus, get engulfed by this political climate that the president has helped churn, and it is harming his caucus. You have seen McConnell be very clear that not just does he believe Dr. Fauci, but that he thinks that mask wearing is important. It's a huge contrast to the president. You think about how easy it is for some officials to say it, and then you think about this sort of needless drama around whether the president was going to wear a mask the other day to a hospital. This is pretty exemplary of where we're at.
You've made a couple of allusions now to Dr. Anthony Fauci, and clearly the White House's effort to discredit him to some degree. What is that about? And the reason I ask is, especially within the business community, I think there's an enormous amount of respect paid to Anthony Fauci, as I think the public does more broadly. So what's the calculus?
Look, it's about a couple of things. Trump has been aggravated with the outsized attention that Fauci gets for a long time. The president and some of his advisors see Fauci as something of a showboat, who they think, and to be clear, I'm not endorsing this view, but their view is that, he tends to his media coverage. And they like to point to things that early on were views of this virus that have changed. The reality is this was a novel virus, so everyone's learning about it at the same time. It is possible to have a nuanced conversation about whether Dr. Fauci was relying on stasis, right, in terms of what was known versus what could be guessed or conceived of, as opposed to just an all-out character assassination, which is what this has turned into. And so you have had President Trump get frustrated with Fauci, as I said early on, all the way back to March, both for his media interviews, for contradicting the president at the podium, and for his disagreement with the president about the possible value of chloroquine as a treatment for people who are infected with the virus, or as a prophylactic to prevent getting it. And so, I think that you have seen all of this feed into the president's mindset and then some of his staff's mindset, and it all sort of fed on each other. And so you had the president out there saying things last week repeatedly, and he'd said it even before that. Fauci's a nice man, but, he made a lot of mistakes. Then suddenly you have the White House formally, albeit not on the record, pushing like an opposition research style document talking about Fauci, things, alleged mistakes he had made, some of which were just quotes that were out of context, and that it didn't allow for the nuance that he had built into what he was saying. And that culminated in an op-ed by the president's trade advisor, not a health expert himself, Pierre Navarro, who has had lots of complaints about Fauci over time, in USA Today, an op-ed that suddenly the president and the president's staff, who had been pushing an anti-Fauci message, suddenly disavowed. So this is not functional, this is not normal, and this is not how you deal with a chief infectious diseases expert in the middle of a pandemic, but it is how this administration does it.
Can you sort of help us understand the pressure points within the White House? You reported this morning about Brad Pascal and a new campaign manager being put in charge. How much of this is a discipline issue, meaning the president's own discipline? As you reported, Jared Kushner said that the president is his own campaign manager. To some degree, Jared Kushner, I think, is also his campaign manager. So how much of this is about rearranging the deck chairs?
I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think that two things can be true at once. I think that there can have been concerns about having somebody running a re-election effort for president who has never been in electoral politics before, and which was Brad Pascal. And you can also recognize that the fundamentals of this race have nothing to do with who Trump's campaign manager is. The fundamentals are about the economy, the virus, and the president's own, I forget exact word you used, but his lack of discipline. I mean, it's more than a lack of discipline. It's that he literally has no control of sort of his impulses, or when he has been able to exhibit it in the past, he is certainly not showing it right now. So, I think that, I do think that Jared Kushner is basically running things for the president. And I think this was an effort to try to just quiet some of the complaints internally. I think that the president has been very angry at Kushner and at Brad Pascal in particular since that debacle of a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 20th, where they bragged about nearly 1 million attendees asking for tickets. And it turned out that they were both punked, it sounds like, from TikTok users, and also just believed their own hype and didn't allow for the reality that their own voters are scared of getting sick. So, I think that the president is his own problem. And this race is, instead of being a choice between Biden and Trump, because he can never let the attention be on anyone else, has ensured that it is a referendum on himself.
How much pressure do you think the business community can bring to bear or be willing to bring to bear relative to the way the president's thinking about the business community versus the base? And one of the things that happened obviously in the last week was a bit of a reversal about visas for online students. Universities around the country put pressure on the White House and said, this isn't going to work. We need you to reverse this. And they did. Now, universities historically have been on the other end of this president. The business community has tried to stay in with the president. But as we get closer to the election, and depending on where the polls are, do you think that he may be more inclined, and this goes to the stimulus and everything else, more inclined to listen to the business community on some of these things?
I do look, and I think in general, I think he has always listened. I think whether he acts is a different issue, but I do think that is true. I think in the case of I would put this in a different category than the stimulus, which I think the business community will have a fair amount of visibility into and get hearings over, particularly given that Steve Mnuchin, while he will not be exclusively negotiating this as he did last time, I think Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, will be in there as well, because a lot of people on Capitol Hill don't like Mnuchin. Mnuchin will still be there as sort of the person who Wall Street trusts. But in terms of this decision about student visas, the administration got basically killed and hammered in the court in the initial hearing. Within the White House, there was a lot of confusion and lack of knowledge about it. This created maximum chaos, almost like the initial travel ban back in early 2017, without a ton of answers. So I think this one is in a bucket of its own. I think whether the president is going to crack down on his staff, the worse the climate gets, I think remains to be seen.
We have lots of questions in. Let me encourage you to continue to send some in. Let me just ask a final question, and then I'm gonna hand it to Jason, who I know has been combing through these questions. We are going to have a convention. What do they call it? IRL, right? In real life.
Real life.
For
You crazy kids in your terms.
Kids say IRL, right?
Kids.
For Trump. And
Right.
and Biden's going to do it as Trump would say from his basement. What do you think the chances are that there actually is a convention, a Republican convention, IRL, as they say?
There will be a convention IRL. It's just that how many attendees there are remains to be seen. We've already seen they've moved the bulk of it to outdoors in Jacksonville, Florida. So yay for us, those of us who are going to be in Jacksonville in the middle of summer outdoors. But they've also limited the participation for some of the nights. It will be just delegates. That takes it from, tens of thousands to just a couple of thousand people. The big question is what the attendance is for the night that the president talks. And we just don't know what that looks like yet. But there will be a convention. The president has refused all requests for the most part that he just let this go. The big question mark, Andrew, obviously, is where Florida is at that point, because Florida is really struggling in terms of the virus. But Florida is run by a governor who is an ally of the president, and they have been pretty accommodating of one another on these kinds of requests.
One last follow then, which is, if the polling discrepancy gets wider, do you see governors and other politicians that have historically been associated with the president turn on him between now and November?
Listen, it's a timely and excellent question. Today, and this is a little different because he's somebody who has considered a run of his own before and is going to, I think, run in the future for president. But Larry Hogan, governor of Maryland, was openly critical of the president in a large piece for the Washington Post that is worth reading to the end. I think that the more that the difficulty for Republicans is that a huge chunk of the Republican base is incredibly loyal to Donald Trump. And so do those voters punish senators and governors and to a lesser degree, Republican House members, those districts are a little different, who step away from him. And I think that's what a lot of these folks are weighing. But I think that McConnell, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to sort of give a space for his caucus to step away from the president because the president is sinking their chances right now.
Okay. Maggie, thank you. I know Jason's on the line, and he's been sifting and sorting through lots of your questions, and I know he has his own as well. Jason.
I am. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Maggie. And thanks everyone else who's been participating. There's thousands of you on this call, and we're trying to get to as many of your questions as possible. And I'm sorry if we can't. And I'm grouping some of them together here. Maggie, a question from Stephen here, which I think is sort of a leading question about, the classic October surprise. As Trump is increasingly backed into a corner and given his proven MO of doubling down rather than retreating, is there a risk of him moving to incite violence or take on China or something like that as we get closer to the election?
I try not to predict because it's impossible to predict. But I would say just in terms of the things that the president is doing right now, in terms of China, I actually think he's choosing areas not to escalate. As even though his language has gotten somewhat tougher in terms of China, much tougher than it was at the beginning of this year, and even through March. But in terms of inciting violence, look, again, that's a pretty loaded question. What I do think we're seeing already is the president saying yesterday that he's going to hold an event next week where he's going to talk about specific cities that are led by Democrats that he says are out of control. That's not openly saying yes, a call to violence, but it is highlighting division and strife in a way that we simply have not seen a president do in the past.
Right. We have a lot of listeners from all over the world here, and there's a fair few questions that are talking about the international dimension of U.S. coronavirus policy. So Gary asks, is the Trump administration's failure to cooperate internationally hindering the search for a vaccine? And then a follow-up to that, I'm going to add from Barbara, is the president going to insert himself in vaccine selection and or approval?
Look, in terms of the last, I'll work backwards. The
Sure.
last question I think is a good and unopened question right now. We just don't know. He has shown a willingness to insert himself in almost everything. So could he do that? It's certainly possible. And he has obviously expressed a desire to have a vaccine by the end of the year. Although some medical professionals have expressed a similar optimism about that. In terms of cooperating globally, look, I mean, I don't know that I can address it specific to a vaccine. I can say that the repeated questioning of the WHO, even though some of the criticisms are legitimate, while this pandemic is still going on, I think has raised concern around the globe about the U.S. role. And broadly, there's a question about, absent U.S. leadership in the middle of a crisis. That I think is something that other countries have been pretty vocal about.
Right. Without getting into forecasting here, maybe we'll just bring this into the present. Julio asks whether you have heard anything about folks in Trump world making any kind of planning of what's next should he lose the election. And I guess, reading between the lines there, are you sensing anybody's kind of preparing for maybe this might not go there?
If I had information about, the future life of Jared Kushner after this ends, I would report it. But I think that, I think that everybody around the president is pretty realistic, and not everybody. Let me rephrase that. I think that some people around the president are pretty realistic about the fact that this is possibly going to end in a couple of months. I think that for those who had a life and identity that was separate from Donald Trump heading into this White House, I think they will have an easier time than those whose identities are completely lashed to the president. But it's too soon to say. I think we will have a better sense of that kind of thing as we get closer to November.
Right. And there's, I'm going to kind of paraphrase a bunch of questions we're getting about Vice President Pence, mainly just around what's his role in all of this that we've been talking about. And also, some asking whether Republicans fearing the polls, and especially if they get worse, would they want to substitute Pence for Trump? But also, like there's this question from Marge, for example, will the president pick a different candidate for vice president running up to the election? Where does Pence fit in all this?
Well, I think Pence stays on the ticket. I don't think that that's a realistic idea. Although I know that there's always, the president helps spark the speculation by quizzing people about whether he should, make a change, or is Pence loyal a couple of years ago. I'm sure there are Republicans who would rather have Pence as the nominee right now. In fact, I know there are Republicans who feel that way, but frankly, there are Republicans who felt that way in 2016 too. This is a lot of wish casting, and it's not based in reality.
Right. Here's a question from an anonymous listener, which I think is a pretty interesting one. If Trump's advantage is the economy, why wouldn't he get behind wearing masks, as that would give the greatest chance of getting the economy going and getting back to some sense of normalcy?
Because he has staked out a position and he doubles down on it, whatever that position is. And because these pronouncements from him are not always linear or logical.
Right.
I don't have a better answer than that. Yes,
that's
obvious.
Fine.
It's obvious that people would feel safer returning to the workplace if there were safeguards in place. This president has struggled with that.
There's also a fair number of questions coming in about the polls, and a lot of deja vu to 2016. Jane asks, is the phenomenon of the, quote, secret Trump voter, unquote, real in the eyes of pollsters? And if so, where are these voters? And also a question from Neil about, these polls showing likely voters with a big lead for Biden. There was something similar in 2016. Might that not repeat itself?
So, look, obviously anything can happen. And I answered a question on CNN with a word choice that I would do differently in retrospect, but just basically about the fact that events can happen, right? In a year where events have dramatically changed everything in the course of, I think it's really been 5 months. There's no reason to assume that 2020 is done with events, and how Joe Biden as a candidate would respond to that, and how his campaign would respond to that. I think if the landscape looks different, I think people can wonder about. But I think that Joe Biden, A, is not Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was defined by 30 years in public life, by sexism, by a lot of things that that Joe Biden just can't be. And the attacks on Joe Biden from the president and his team just have not worked so far. Whether they will eventually work, I think you can wonder about. But right now they're clearly not working. And Joe Biden's lead in these polls is much bigger than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016. So that's the other thing I think people need to worry about. Are there people who are not telling pollsters the truth entirely? That's certainly possible. But there's just no reason to believe that literally every single poll was wrong.
Right.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Of course you can.
I think that people have this strange belief as like, they treat polls as if they're this Ouija board that is separate from elections. Like if people don't like Donald Trump, they should vote. That's how this works. And I think the biggest question in terms of polls right now is we just don't know what voting is going to look like in November. Will all states be able to do in-person voting? How many states are going to do mail-in? Will we know on election night who the winner is? Those are, I think, the big outstanding questions.
Right. Another question from Hal here. Will Biden's choice of VP affect Trump's prospects?
I don't think that VPs change elections. I do think the VP choice matters here more given Biden's age. And I think that is something that Biden is aware of. Also, I think just in terms of, Biden's relationship with the left wing of his party. But I don't, other than giving Trump a new target, I don't think it makes a huge difference.
Right. And Christopher asking another semi-speculative question here. What are your thoughts on the Trump administration announcing a national mask mandate? What are the odds of that?
Extremely unlikely. It's in reality, it would be very hard to do such a thing and make it compliant. But I also just don't think it's something that the president has any desire to do. I think he hears from enough people who don't like masks that he doesn't want to.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that?
Go ahead.
For just 1 second, which is there's speculation, obviously, that if Vice President Biden were to win and become the president, and if there was continued spread of COVID at that point, that there might be a considerable effort to try to lock down the country in a more meaningful way than there is now. Given the way the governors, though, have approached this and the way the president has approached this and maybe how we've all been preconditioned, how difficult do you think something like that actually would be?
Can you restate that, Andrew? I'm sorry, the audio faded out for 1 second.
Just the idea, given how preconditioned we have been in this circumstance, given the leadership in the country and the way certain governors have acted around masking, I think there's a view that if Biden were to win and there was still spread of COVID, that there would be an effort at least to try to make a more national kind of lockdown effort, at least on masking, if not more so. But is that even a plausible or possible thing to have happen given what's already happened?
I think it's plausible. I think it would be difficult, but I do think that if Biden were to win, I think that just the difference would be mostly in terms of the example that the person in office sets, right? Biden wears a mask all the time, has been very pro-mask. I think that we tend not to think about how much of a trickle-down effect what our national leaders do has, but Trump's signaling that masks are bad or that they're quote unquote politically correct or some kind of protest symbol against him has an impact.
I'd like to follow up on that with this question from William about vaccines. How do you think the vaccinephobes, the anti-vaxxers, will be addressed or persuaded to take seriously when a vaccine comes out? A lot of people in the country are expected not to take one, and Trump has some maybe previous on this.
Yeah, Trump has a history of raising questions about vaccines and their safety. He did it during the campaign. He really hasn't since he became president. There was a brief interlude where Bobby Kennedy Jr. was going to do something with him. questioning the safety of vaccines, and then that went away pretty quickly. That was during the transition. But a lot of it, look, it will depend on when it happens, and it'll depend on who's in office. And if it happens when Donald Trump is still in office, I think again, him encouraging people to trust a vaccine will matter, because there's a huge portion of people in this country who only listen to what he says. That makes the converse true as well. As if Biden is president, will these people who are devoted to Donald Trump, will they be swayed against it because of who the messenger is? That's the danger of the polarization we have in the country right now.
Right. Joe asks, is there any likelihood that Biden would simply forego face-to-face debates with Trump altogether and simply try to ride his poll advantage through November 3rd? And I suppose my follow-up to that to be like, what do you expect the nature of the debates to be, or how is the Trump White House preparing for those? Because that might be the only real campaigning.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Trump folks have been trying to engage in a pretty classic underdog tactic, which is call for more debates. When they started doing that, it was a real clear sign that they know that their position has shifted. The president was, a year ago, discussing doing debates not with the Commission on Presidential Debates. The Biden folks have said that they'll do what the commission says. I think there will be 3 debates, most likely. Whether there are studio audiences, I think, is the question. As there have been in the past, we have seen Biden, and who that benefits, who knows? Biden has debated without a studio audience. He debated Bernie Sanders for, I think, 2 hours during the primary when COVID was beginning to creep across the country. And there was no audience, and that Biden performed well. I think the big question is not whether there's a studio audience, but it's how negative President Trump goes in the debate.
And we are just about out of time, but I want to sneak in this one from Robert. What factors or events do you think could cause a narrowing of the gap in polls, or even a Trump victory? Are there scenarios that you're hearing from the Trump camp about, like, if only this, then you'll see, etc.?
If only Donald Trump would stop tweeting. If only Donald Trump would
Is it that simple?
Well, if only Donald Trump would stop talking about injecting bleach. I mean, seriously, like, these are the kinds of things that people are talking about. It would require, it requires the president to be somebody different than who he has been. Now, again, I go back to what I said earlier, which is that I think events could reshape the campaign. There are events that could happen that could change what voters' priorities are. But that is so speculative that it's really hard for me to say what it would look like.
Right. Well, that's terrific. Thanks very much for that, Maggie, and thanks everyone for all your questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but again, there's thousands of you on this call, and we thank you for that. And I am going to hand it back to Andrew for some closing remarks.
Jason, thank you. And thank you for navigating all those questions. As Jason mentioned, there were so many, and we should probably, Maggie, we have to do this more often, because a lot of people want to talk to you. We want to thank Maggie Haberman. It's a privilege to spend time with her and to get her insights on all of these issues. And we do hope to do it again with her very soon. I should tell everybody before we go that the New York Times is doing a series of these online events. There's another one actually tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern Time called Elections 2020, The Unconventional Conventions. It's hosted by Deputy Politics Editor Rachel Dry, with a handful of special guests. And if you want to participate in it, you can RSVP to that and the full slate of digital events at timesevents.nytimes.com. And also a plug for DealBook debriefs next week. Next Thursday, we're going to have a fabulous conversation. David Sanger is going to join us to talk about tech and national security. We're going to talk about Huawei and TikTok, the new digital Cold War, and so many other cybersecurity headlines that we've been following. And David, of course, is our security expert and is so insightful on so many issues. So keep an eye out for an RSVP to that, which you'll be able to get through the DealBook newsletter, probably starting on Monday. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Jason, thank you. Maggie, thank you. And all of you for your fabulous questions. We look forward to seeing or hearing we'll be in your ears basically, and hopefully in your inboxes very, very soon, tomorrow, and then of course on the call next Thursday. Thanks everybody. Have a great week.